how can a simple glossary entry transform into a subtle piece of propaganda, turning a word like equity into a political verdict before the debate even starts? We are diving deep into the fascinating methods of persuasive language today, exploring the mechanics that allow the vocabulary itself to, well, pre-win an argument.
This deep dive is fundamentally a linguistic audit for anyone who needs to be well-informed, whether you're, prepping for a meeting, writing policy, or just trying to have a rational conversation with someone who sees things differently. The language we use, it's the foundation of any debate, right? And when those foundations are intentionally manipulated, the whole discussion just becomes almost impossible to navigate.
That really is the core of our mission today. We are unpacking an audit focused on a very specific technique of informational control. It's about embedding a political conclusion, a definitive verdict, right inside the definition of a key term.
Right. Deliberately moving it away from its neutral, descriptive, or common usage.
We're looking at how language can be subtly, but very effectively weaponized.
And the source material for this deep dive, it's based on excerpts from an audit of propagandistic definition. It specifically analyzed content from a site known as New Discourses. The analysis focused on comparing how specific, high-stakes socio-political terms are defined on that site against, well, a whole stack of mainstream and proponent baselines. The American Psychological Association's EDI framework, Merriam-Webster's descriptive usage, and wider academic sources, like the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, really established references.
Got it. And the main finding of the entire audit, the sort of TLDR, is pretty stark, isn't it?
It is. 4 out of 5 core terms they reviewed were found to meet a clear, replicable threshold for what the audit calls persuasive or propagandistic redefinition.
Wow, 4 out of 5.
And the 5th term, which is maybe the most fascinating case of rhetorical maneuvering, is heavily contested and actively drifting toward persuasive depending on which page of the site you happen to land on.
Okay, so quite a pattern there.
A definite pattern. And the important takeaway for you, the listener, is that we're focused entirely on the mechanics of communication here. We're not advocating for or against the political ideas within these terms. We're simply exposing the structural techniques used to frame and, well, control the conversation around those ideas.
It's about understanding the architecture, you could say, of belief systems constructed through language.
That's a good way to put it.
And as always, if you want to dig into the technical details, the full methodology of the research, maybe notes on the AI persona that helps structure this whole deep dive, you'll find all those resources waiting for you in the Substack description link below.
So shall we get into the step-by-step, how this linguistic manipulation is actually identified?
Let's do it.
Okay, so the central idea of the audit is recognizing that point where a definition stops acting like a dictionary entry, a neutral description of common usage, and starts acting like an argument.
Right.
The audit targets definitions that basically preempt the debate by embedding a verdict, often a negative value judgment, rather than sticking to a neutral, widely accepted sense of the term.
Could you give us maybe a simpler example, like outside the political stuff for a second?
Sure. Take a simple term like tree. A neutral definition describes its structure, biology, function, right?
Yeah, basic stuff.
But a persuasive definition might define it as a woody perennial plant, often a dangerous liability to property owners, designed by nature to undermine foundations. See that last clause?
Dangerous liability, undermine foundations. That's the verdict baked right in.
It is. It changes the whole emotional and maybe even legal context of the term tree. Now, in the socio-political arena, the stakes are obviously much higher. Instead of defining equity neutrally, focusing on systemic fairness or meeting needs, the definition itself contains a pejorative comparison, like the example used in the audit. Equity is social communism.
So the argument is already over before you even get to think about policy implications or what fairness might mean in context.
You've got it. The definition dictates the conclusion.
So how did the audit actually detect this systematically? It sounds slippery.
Well, it had to be highly rigorous. The method started by literally freezing the site's wording, capturing the specific URL and the exact quote so the definition couldn't be changed later, archiving it.
Okay, makes sense. Step 1, pin it down.
Step 2, build side-by-side snapshots. They compared the site's definitions directly with widely used mainstream and proponent references. The audit called these corpus proxies.
Corpus proxies. That sounds a bit academic. Can you break down what that means in practical terms for us?
Of course. Yeah, it does sound a bit formal, but it's just a reliable, neutral example of how the word is actually used professionally in the real world. Think of it as establishing a baseline, a standard reference point.
Okay.
They used reputable dictionaries like Merriam-Webster for descriptive language, how people generally use the word, and crucially, professional body definitions.
Like the APA's EDI framework you mentioned.
Yes, that was a key one. They used that to establish a strong sense of the term's common usage among practitioners and academics in that specific field. If you're discussing a concept used by psychologists, the APA's definition is probably the most authoritative proxy for how professionals understand and apply it.
Right, so they were establishing the sort of default defensible meaning, the accepted meaning.
After establishing those baselines, they tested the contested definitions against a really clear set of criteria. They were looking for persuasive elements, for Motte-and-bailey patterns, we'll get into that, and for significant intentional shifts in the scope or the valence.
Valence meaning the emotional charge, positive or negative.
Correct. Is the definition itself loading the term emotionally? This allowed them to issue a final plain language verdict against those acceptance criteria.
Okay, so there's a checklist involved.
There is. And this criteria checklist is, I think, invaluable for anyone reading content that's designed to persuade. The audit identified 3 core mechanisms used to achieve this persuasive redefinition. The checklist.
Okay, let's walk through them. What's the first criterion on the checklist?
The first one, and often the most immediate one to spot, is persuasive definition.
Right.
This is the smuggling of a value judgment, or, almost always in these cases, a predetermined negative conclusion directly into the definitional core itself. The definition doesn't just describe the word as it's used, it tells you what to conclude about the word.
So it's not just defining, it's judging within the definition.
Precisely. If the definition of a term like progressive, for instance, contains within it the phrase, a destructive ideology leading to national collapse, well, the definition has stopped describing and started arguing.
It completely blocks off any neutral engagement, doesn't it? You can't even consider the term's traditional meaning, maybe favoring gradual reform or liberal values, because the required verdict, destruction, is now baked into the word itself.
It short-circuits critical thought immediately. You're forced onto the defensive from the get-go.
Okay, that's persuasive definition. What's the second mechanism? This one sounds a bit more subtle.
It is. The second criterion is asymmetric sampling. This is a highly effective, sort of nonverbal method of persuasion. It relates to how the evidence for the definition is selectively gathered and presented. It's about what's left out.
How does that process actually work in practice? What does it look like when sources fail to balance their sampling, and how does that omission affect the listener or reader?
Well, asymmetric sampling means the lexicon pages, the definitions, they rarely, if ever, lay out the moderate, professional, or proponent baselines first. They actively skip the neutral context.
So they don't give you the standard view first?
Not usually. For instance, in the audit, pages talking about equity might completely ignore the APA's detailed systemic EDI framework, which, remember, discusses needs-based resource distribution to achieve parity. Or they might ignore Merriam-Webster's standard descriptive sense of equity as just fairness or justice. They jump straight to presenting the most extreme, negative, verdict-laden definition as if it's the primary or even the only definitive meaning.
Ah, I see. The insight here is pretty profound then. By consistently omitting the moderate professional definition, the polemical definition stops looking like an outlier critique.
And starts functioning as the only definition available.
Right. The reader might be totally unaware there are these conventional policy-based definitions out there. They're only ever given the argument, but it's disguised as a simple definition.
It effectively creates a kind of false consensus around the charged interpretation. It makes that charged definition the default.
Which means any subsequent discussion about fairness or needs-based resources becomes almost irrelevant. You're forced to operate on the terms set by the persuasive definition, usually shifting the conversation from, say, policy to ideology.
Nailed it.
Okay, that's asymmetric sampling. And the third mechanism, you mentioned a hiding place.
Yes. The third is the rhetorical hiding place, the technique that makes the persuasion highly difficult to pin down sometimes. Motte-and-bailey drift. It describes a conversational retreat and advance, a highly strategic linguistic movement used to avoid accountability for an extreme claim while still maximizing its persuasive power.
Can you provide an example of how this drift manifests across different pages on the same website? Show us the actual move from the, let's say, defensible claim to the more loaded one.
Okay, think of that medieval castle design. The bailey is the large, vulnerable outer courtyard. It's fertile ground where all the everyday activities happen. That's where you want to operate. The motte is the small, stone, easily defensible tower, or keep at the center, a safe retreat.
Got it. Bailey is the big claim, Motte is the safe spot.
In this context, the Bailey is the broad, explosive, charged claim you want people to believe. For example, calling an entire academic discipline race Marxism. That's a big claim. The Motte is the narrow, defensible, often quite neutral definition hidden away on a glossary page somewhere.
Okay, so how does the drift work?
This drift occurs when a relatively neutral lexicon page, the Motte, the small, defensible keep, coexists on the same site with much more polemical content like essays or podcasts. These longer formats greatly expand, charge up, or inflate the same term.
You have the quiet definition here and the loud argument over there, using the same word.
Right. And when challenged on the academic accuracy of the extreme claim, say, someone points out that the term is just a legal theory, the site can retreat back to the narrow, defensible definition in the glossary. They can say, look, we defined it neutrally here. We never said that in the glossary.
But the damage is done by the louder claim.
That's the strategy. They use the narrow definition, the Motte, to defend against criticism, but they advance the broad, loaded claim, the Bailey, in their highly visible content, which is where the bulk of the persuasive work actually happens. The overall corpus ensures that the extreme charged claim, the Bailey, is what sticks in the listener's mind.
Clever in a way. Deceptive, but clever.
It's a powerful rhetorical tool.
And the audit established a threshold for flagging this stuff, right? How many criteria needed to be met?
The threshold was clear. Definitions were flagged as problematic or disingenuous. If two or more of these audit criteria, persuasive definition, asymmetric sampling, or Motte-and-bailey drift were met.
Two or more. That provides a clear, systematic way to audit content, regardless of its political leaning, presumably.
That was the goal. Focus on the structure, not the specific politics.
Okay, let's move to the evidence then. Let's see these three mechanisms in action, starting with what the audit called the highest stakes term reviewed, equity.
Right, equity. The new Discourses lexicon defined equity by drawing a very stark, immediate contrast with equality. The definition stated, and I'm quoting parts here, where equality means that citizen A and citizen B are treated equally, equity means adjusting shares in order to make citizens A and B equal. And then it adds, in that sense, equity is something like a kind of social communism.
Social communism. Wow, okay. That's direct. How does that compare to the established professional baselines, the corpus proxies the audit used?
Well, the divergence is immediate and, frankly, vast. The American Psychological Association, in its EDI framework, defines equity completely differently. They talk about it as an intentional systemic framework for fair treatment and full participation.
Focusing on?
Specifically, providing resources according to need to enable the best outcomes for everyone. The focus is on needs and systemic fairness, structural issues.
And what about just common language, like Merriam-Webster?
Even simpler. Merriam-Webster defines equity neutrally as fairness or justice. Often, it adds freedom from disparities, and importantly, it emphasizes its distinction from strict equality of treatment. The focus in standard usage is always on process, structure, and meeting needs, not solely on forcing identical outcomes, which is what the contested definition really hammers on.
So the audit must have found some pretty severe issues here. Did it tick off the criteria?
It ticked off all three criteria strongly. First, flagged for persuasive definition. That pejorative verdict, calling it social communism, isn't presented as an external critique. It's built right into the definition itself. It is the definition.
And the consequence of that is huge, right?
It is. By defining equity as social communism, the entire policy debate about systemic fairness or needs-based resources just gets shut down before it starts.
Yeah, you're immediately forced to defend against this charge of Marxist state control. You can't even begin to discuss what fair policy might look like.
You're stuck arguing about radical ideology instead.
What else did they find for equity?
Secondly, there's a clear scope valence shift. The contested definition narrows equity only to forced outcome equalization. It completely strips away the fairness or needs-based focus of the professional baselines. That shift in scope drastically changes the term's meaning, especially in any kind of actionable policy environment.
It redefines the goal entirely.
And thirdly, it was cited for asymmetric sampling. The page failed to neutrally present the AAPA or Merriam-Webster usage first. It just jumped straight to the negative definition, presenting it as the primary immediate meaning.
Creating that false consensus we talked about earlier.
So the verdict here was pretty definitive, persuasive propagandistic redefinition. This example really shows the power of embedding that ideological conclusion right from the very first sentence.
It really does. And this case study on equity demonstrates how absolutely critical it is to insist on those neutral baselines before you accept a definition that's clearly loaded. If you find this kind of linguistic audit as fascinating as we do, please take just a moment right now to like, subscribe, and maybe ring the bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into the language of power.
Okay, so continuing our exploration, let's move to a closely related, very high-profile organizational term, DEI, or Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. Here, the persuasive definition technique seemed to move beyond just labeling a single term. It labeled and charged an entire industry structure.
How so? What was the framing?
One podcast essay on the new Discourses site framed DEI very, very aggressively. It tied it directly to political control. They argued, and again, quoting snippets, equity is a rebranding of socialism. Diversity and inclusion are tools to install political officers. The DEI industry is a racket designed to install commissars for its ideology.
Racket, commissars, install political officers. That language is, well, it's extremely charged. What do the professional baselines, the corpus proxies, say about DEI? Is it presented as a political takeover mechanism?
Not at all. The professional standard, which the audit derived again from the APA's EDI frame pages, defines DEI quite differently. It's seen as an intentional, systemic approach to achieving fairness, participation, and context-appropriate resources.
So more like guidance.
Essentially, yes, guidance for inclusive professional and organizational practice. It's generally understood as an HR or organizational development framework, not presented as a political control system aiming for ideological purity.
The contrast is pretty significant then. What were the audit findings here? Which mechanisms were at play?
The findings centered on two main mechanisms. First, it was definitely flagged for persuasive definition, because those highly charged conclusions calling the industry a racket and the practitioners commissars are presented within the definitional context. They aren't offered as external criticism, they're part of the explanation of what DEI is, according to that source.
Okay, so verdict embedded again. What else?
Perhaps the most interesting finding here, I think, was what the audit termed valence and agency inflation.
Valence and agency inflation. Break that down for us.
Okay. The definition imputes a coordinated, almost malicious control system. It talks about a mechanism explicitly designed to install political officers. That attributes a level of conscious, coordinated agency and negative intent, the valence that is entirely absent from the standard professional baselines, which describe it more as a process or a set of goals.
Can you elaborate maybe on the difference between describing a framework, which sounds bureaucratic, and attributing this agency inflation?
Certainly. Look, if you say a company adopted a DEI framework, you're describing, well, a bureaucratic set of policies, maybe run by an HR department, could be effective, could be ineffective. It's a system.
Right. Procedures, guidelines.
But if you say that the company has installed commissars through a racket, you've suddenly inflated the agency involved. It's gone from a potentially benign, if maybe clumsy, bureaucratic process to implying a coordinated, high-level political conspiracy designed to seize control.
So the definition doesn't just critique the policy outcomes, it attributes this malevolent, centralized intent to basically everyone and every structure involved in the system.
That's the inflation. That inflation of negative intent, coupled with the persuasive definition, secured the verdict. Persuasive propagandistic redefinition for DEI as well.
Okay. Moving from organizational practice now into more theoretical territory, the audit applied the same mechanisms to concepts rooted in intellectual history and sociology. Let's talk about cultural Marxism.
Right. Now, this is a complex term. It has a very contested history, often associated with intellectual traditions coming out of the Frankfurt School, among others.
It's definitely a loaded term in many contexts.
It is. The new Discourses definition, which the audit sourced from a 2024 essay on the site, introduced a really high level of coordinated intent. It described Western cultural Marxism as something that, quote, sought to find a way to infiltrate and seize the means of production of Western civilizational culture, opening it up to socialism or communism.
Infiltrate and seize. Again, very strong language, implying conscious strategy over decades. How do mainstream references discuss cultural Marxism, especially given, as you said, the term's complicated history?
Well, mainstream scholarly overviews typically describe cultural Marxism as more of an umbrella term. It's used, sometimes descriptively, sometimes critically, to discuss heterogeneous intellectual currents, various strands of thought derived from the Frankfurt School, the British New Left, and other critical traditions.
So not one unified thing.
Generally not presented that way in academic sources. Crucially, these sources also document the term's contested usage. They often note its frequent use in polemical or even conspiracist senses, particularly in right-wing discourse. But they don't typically present it as a single, unified, coordinated, decades-long doctrine seeking to infiltrate and seize cultural production as if it were a planned operation.
So the audit's finding here must have focused on that difference in attributed intent.
Heavily. It's centered on intent, inflation, and consolidation. The site's definition essentially recast these diffuse, varied, sometimes even competing academic and political traditions as one singular, coordinated, and highly intentional project under this banner of infiltrate and seize.
It takes disparate ideas and bundles them into a conspiracy narrative.
That's how the audit framed the effect. And because this intent-ascribing frame sits explicitly inside the definitional treatment of the term, rather than being offered as an external, perhaps nuanced argument against its effects.
It fully met the criteria for persuasive definition.
Correct. So the verdict for cultural Marxism, according to the audit's criteria, was also clear. Persuasive propagandistic redefinition.
Okay, so we've seen 3 clear cases. Now we come to the one term that the audit found to be more nuanced, the one that you said perfectly illustrates the strategic application of Motte-and-bailey. Critical race theory, or CRT.
Yes, CRT is unique in this analysis because the audit identified that the site effectively operates with 2 fundamentally different definitions available for this term simultaneously. It has 2 faces for CRT.
2 faces? How so?
Well, one face is found on the ND Lexicon page. This page offers a relatively close to mainstream descriptor. It calls CRT a scholarly and political approach to examining race. Institutions and processes are race-based. It's fairly dry, fairly academic sounding. This is the narrow, defensible definition.
Okay, the safe ground. What's the other face?
The second face is found almost ubiquitously elsewhere on the site, in the ND essays and polemical framing. And here, you find descriptions of CRT as an all-explaining doctrine, sometimes a quasi-religion, or a totalizing ideology. The essay titles themselves often reveal this scope inflation, things like 8 big reasons CRT is terrible.
So a huge difference between the glossary entry and the essays discussing it.
A massive difference. And the audit identifies critical race theory, CRT, as the clearest instance of this Motte-and-bailey availability across the site's content. This availability allows the site to sustain a maximum rhetorical claim while maintaining a minimum academic defense.
Can you walk us through practically how the site uses this strategy? How does it shift its claim about CRT when faced with criticism? Let's see the Motte-and-bailey in action.
Okay, think of it as a kind of intellectual insurance policy. The site clearly wants the audience to absorb the emotional impact of the totalizing ideology or race Marxism claim. That's the high-impact, high-value, but vulnerable Bailey.
That's the message they want to stick.
Right. But if, say, a university professor or a critic who is actually knowledgeable about legal scholarship points out, hey, wait a minute, CRT is fundamentally a legal academic movement originating in the 70s and 80s with fairly narrow tenets. What can the site do?
They retreat.
They can instantly retreat to the narrow, neutral lexicon description, the defensible Motte. They can simply point to their glossary page and say, effectively, look, we provided a scholarly definition right here. We acknowledge its academic roots.
So the Motte acts as a shield, protecting the site from being easily dismissed as completely academically inaccurate or uninformed.
While the Bailey does all the heavy lifting of persuasion out there in the wider media environment, in the essays, the podcasts, the social media posts, the site is rarely, if ever, forced to actually debate the narrow technical definition found in the Motte.
Because the public conversation is always being pulled towards the broad, charged claim of the Bailey.
That's the rhetorical magic, if you want to call it that, of the technique. The site maintains academic deniability while advancing this massive emotional charge against the term. The overall effect on the reader or listener is almost certainly the conflation of a relatively narrow scholarly pursuit with a massive threatening political agenda.
So what was the final verdict for CRT given this split?
The verdict reflected this dynamic. The term was deemed contested but fair, but drifting strongly towards persuasive. The reasoning was that the overall persuasive effect across the entire content corpus is undeniable, even if the specific glossary page, the Motte itself, is technically quite close to some baseline descriptions. The use of the term across the site pushes it into persuasive territory.
It's a page-dependent verdict, almost.
In a sense, yes. And it's helpful here, maybe, to understand the linguistic context of that word, critical, in critical race theory.
Where does that come from?
Well, the lineage comes from critical theory, more broadly, which originated with thinkers associated with the Frankfurt School back in the mid-20th century. In that intellectual tradition, The term critical functions academically to integrate normative critique, judging things against a standard of justice or fairness with analysis, often for the explicit purpose of transforming society. It isn't just descriptive, it has a transformative goal built in.
So critical implies a critique aimed at change.
That's the general idea in that academic context. Understanding this professional baseline helps distinguish between, say, an internal critique of legal or social systems aiming for reform, which is often how proponents describe CRT, versus the polemical claims that charge it as some kind of external conspiracy seeking to destroy Western culture. The baseline matters for context.
Okay. That brings us to the fifth and final case study, the broad term social justice. Did the audit find a similar pattern here?
It found a very familiar pattern, yes. A widespread persuasive framing was identified here as well.
How did it manifest for social justice?
On some of the lexicon or overview pages on the site, the language used sometimes did align, at least partially, with mainstream descriptions. You might see references to structural inequality or the importance of participation. This provides a kind of neutral facade, a potential motte. But, similar to the other cases, numerous other essays and pieces of content across the new discourses, corpus casts social justice in a very different light, as fundamentally illiberal, anti-democratic, and posing a severe threat to civil society. The Bailey was very strong and very negative.
So the finding for social justice was essentially recognizing that same pattern again.
Yes, it was strong pattern recognition. The audit concluded there was pervasive use of Motte-and-bailey availability plus persuasive framing across the entire body of content relating to the term. It wasn't just about one specific definition, but a consistent site-wide rhetorical strategy applied to social justice.
And the verdict reflected that site-wide view.
It did. Based on that corpus-level assessment, the overall effect earned the verdict. Persuasive propagandistic redefinition at the site level for social justice.
It really seems understanding the difference between what a word is descriptively and what it's being actively used for persuasively is just foundational to navigating these complex political landscapes.
It truly is. And if you want practical tools to help navigate these kinds of belief systems and conversations, especially when you're faced with heavily charged language like this, we highly recommend you take the Free Street Epistemology course. It's available at navigatingbeliefs.com. This kind of systematic inquiry often starts with questioning the definitions people are using.
That's a great resource. So let's try to synthesize these findings now into maybe a practical checklist for our listeners. The audit clearly demonstrated that this pattern of persuasive definition is highly replicable across all the core terms reviewed.
Yeah.
We saw these three mechanisms pop up again and again.
Yes, they offered a reliable indicator of when a definition is trying to argue rather than simply describe.
Okay, so mechanism one.
First, the consistent use of embedded pejoratives. This means putting those negative labels directly inside the definition, transforming a simple descriptor into an immediate judgment.
Like social communism for equity or Racket and Commissars for DEI.
Those are the prime examples from the audit. This forces the conversation to begin at that ideological extreme, framing the term negatively from the outset.
Okay, mechanism two.
Second, that insidious pattern of asymmetric sampling. This is the consistent strategic pattern of ignoring or severely caricaturing the professional baselines, the APA framework, standard dictionaries, common usage before presenting the verdict first definition.
By sidestepping the common moderate understanding.
They clear the rhetorical space, they make room for the polemical framing to take center stage, almost as if it's the only way to understand the term.
Got it. And mechanism three?
And third, the reliable availability of the Motte-and-bailey structure. This strategy ensures that those narrow, neutral definitions are somewhere available for defensive purposes, when challenged on scholarly grounds. It provides deniability. But the broad loaded claims, the Baileys are always immediately available to, and they're deployed constantly for advancing the political argument in wider discussion formats like essays and podcasts, maximizing the rhetorical impact.
So this replicable three-part pattern means the audit gives you, the listener, a pretty solid, reliable mini checklist, doesn't it?
I think so. Whenever you encounter a definition for a highly contested term, whether it's equity, CRT, social justice, or something else entirely, you can now systematically check. 1. Does this definition contain a verdict or a strong value judgment? 2. Has it ignored or misrepresented the most common or professional definitions? Did it skip the baseline? And 3. Is there significant expansion or charging up of this claim found in other, more polemical content nearby, suggesting a Motte-and-bailey might be in play?
That's a very useful takeaway.
So let's just consolidate the significance of this work. This audit provides not just a critique of one particular site, but really a universal structural checklist you can apply anywhere. When you encounter a charged definition for a term like equity or social justice or CRT or anything similar, you're now equipped to systematically determine if that definition is trying to argue for a position, or if it's simply describing common usage.
And the essential step for any informed consumer of information, as we've seen, is always to check multiple reputable proponent and mainstream references first.
Absolutely. Look at things like the APA framework if it's relevant. Check the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy for philosophical terms. Look at standard descriptive dictionaries like Merriam-Webster or the OED. Understand the term's established context before you accept a highly charged prescriptive definition someone else is pushing.
It anchors your understanding in a sort of shared reality, a common ground.
It attempts to, yes. Because when the definition itself is the verdict, it just eliminates the space needed for genuine disagreement. The language has already passed judgment before the conversation can even begin.
The challenge, then, for the well-informed learner, for anyone trying to engage thoughtfully, is to insist on neutral descriptive language first, before accepting a prescriptive argument disguised as a definition.
We have to ensure we're arguing about policy or philosophy or impact, not just arguing about the dictionary because someone has rigged it.
Which leads to a pretty provocative final thought, doesn't it? The power of a shared language, of civil discourse, relies on having some kind of shared starting point, shared definitions. But what happens to that discourse when the very vocabulary we use to debate key concepts already contains the political conclusion? If the starting point is already compromised, if equity means social communism before the discussion even begins, or DEI is a racket by definition, what is the future for genuine thought, for productive disagreement, for actually solving problems together?
It's a critical question, and we want to hear your insights on this.
We do. Start a conversation about the future of thought, and maybe about the definitions that matter most to you right now, down in the comments section below. We genuinely look forward to seeing what you uncover and what you think about these mechanisms.
Keep questioning those definitions.